I'm very happy today to receive Rutger Hoekstra, who will present some of his work on replacing the GDP by 2030. We'll still give it a few minutes to make sure everyone is connected. And please, the way we're going to work today is that we're going to have a 35 minutes presentation by Rutger, followed by a 20 minutes Q&A. The presentation will be recorded and will be posted on our website of the Center for International Environmental Studies in about a week's time. And we ask every participant to unmute their microphone when you come in. Okay, so make sure to unmute your microphone. For now, okay, I can see it now. We have about 40 participants connected. So again, welcome to this e-seminar, which is part of a series of seminars that our regular interdisciplinary seminars are held bi-monthly at the Graduate Institute, and now we moved some of our series online. So we're very happy to welcome you. Okay, again, so for all the people who are arriving right now, please mute your microphones. And there will be a chance to ask questions in the Q&A, so you'll have to write down your question and send them to the panelists so we can ask the questions afterwards. Okay, I think it's time. So let me start this seminar and highly welcome Rutger Hoekstra. So Rutger is our speaker for today. He's an environmental economist, founder of Metrics for the Future. He has about 20 years of experience on working on the quantification of value, well-being, and sustainability measure from an academic, government, statistical, and business perspective. And he's the author of Beyond GDP by 2030, which he will introduce to us today. He has worked with the United Nations, the OECD, the World Bank, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank, among others. I am myself personally pleased to see Rutger today because Rutger did his PhD in environmental economics when I was also there in that time at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And he has worked afterwards at Statistics Netherlands. And he's also now a lecturer at the Leiden University in the Netherlands. So welcome, Rutger. Very nice to have you here. And without further ado, I would like to give you the virtual floor. So you can start sharing your screen.
Thank you, Joël. Thank you very much for that introduction. Very much looking forward, of course, also to the questions at the end. I'm very pleased to be speaking to you today. As Joël said, we studied together. Our PhDs were in environmental economics, and afterwards I started to work for the Dutch Statistical Office. And as students, as PhD students, we're of course told all the time that GDP was a flawed metric, that it wasn't a measure of success. But then when I went to the Statistical Office, it became abundantly clear that there is this hugely dominant indicator, GDP, and journalists would flock into the press briefings for GDP. And whenever we had any statistics on the environment or social issues, people would generally have a lot less interest. Am I sharing the screen fully? Yep. So actually what I did in the book was bundle kind of my thoughts on, how might we get rid of this very dominant indicator, or how might we actually create alternatives for it. And I'll be discussing that in this presentation. So to set the scene, we need to really get a good grip on the problem. And I think one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, why is GDP so successful? Why do we all know what it is? Why do we, pay attention to economic growth figures so much? Second question, which is crucial, is what does it measure and what does it not, of course? And the third question is, why, after 50 years of generating all types of alternatives, have we not been successful in, creating some kind of different metric that we listen to? And from those three questions, I'll be presenting the solution that I suggest in the book. And I think it would also be interesting to kind of have the Corona crisis also as a backdrop. What would it mean actually for beyond GDP? Now, I will be going through the second question quite quickly. So what does GDP measure and what not? For the sake of time, and because this is actually is very much discussed in the literature. So we need it for our discussion, but I'll be going through that fairly quickly. So if you do have questions about that, please use the Q&A, and Joël in the end will put those questions to me. So the first thing is, why is GDP so successful? We're very used to thinking of GDP as being everywhere in the world. Every quarter in many countries it's published. But actually, if you look at it from a historical perspective, that situation, if you just go back 100 years, was not actually the case. In 1900, there were only actually 9 countries that had ever measured national income in their entire history. And from that situation where we had 9 countries, suddenly we are now 100 years later in a situation where 200 plus countries are measuring GDP. So when you want to understand why GDP is so successful, it's also important to know, how did this social innovation really capture the entire world? Well, there's actually 4 periods that I identify in the book, and I spend quite a lot of time on that. But for here, I think the summary is that macroeconomic statistics and macroeconomists proved themselves in the crisis years. So the Great Depression and the Second World War were very important for people to understand how important it is to understand your macroeconomy. And economists did a lot of work on logistically planning the war and also the aftermath of the Great Depression. And then really that period after the war is what I call the golden age. That is when economists basically became the advisors for government and society. And after the 1970s, that honeymoon was kind of over. People started to realize that, environmental issues, social issues were also very important. And I've even put a fourth period, which I call the demise question mark, which is basically started after the financial crisis. You could perhaps from a historical perspective in 50 years, perhaps you might say that was the beginning of the end of GDP or economic thinking, although I think there's also a lot of evidence that we're still grinding along, so to speak. So what actually did economists create during the golden age? Well, they created something I call the GDP multinational. So think of like McDonald's or creating the Big Mac all across the world. I think actually the GDP multinational is fairly similar, that in every country there's a statistical office, there are policy institutes, universities, there is media, there's politicians paying attention to these numbers, and there's of course society. And actually in each of the 200 countries, this infrastructure has been laid out where there's statistics, there's policy, there's media, politics, and society. So it's actually a wonderful infrastructure, logistically speaking. And not only do they have kind of a vertical production line of Big Macs, they actually also have they can interconnect. So in a couple of days, China will be publishing its GDP figures for the first quarter. And it's pretty obvious that the media in the United States or Germany will also be covering that really significantly. And an additional fact is that we have all kinds of international institutes that are, of course, doing growth projections, and also those are being disseminated to our media and to our politics. So just from a logistical point of view, it's a fabulous multinational that is doing a wonderful job at spreading the news of economics, of macroeconomic statistics. And I think sometimes we should not look at it from a critical perspective, but rather admire what a huge infrastructure they have laid out for themselves, basically. Now, there is one secret to this multinational, and it's something that a few people, I think, sometimes realize, and that is something called the system of national accounts. So the fact that GDP is measured all over the world in the same way is because there is a system of national accounts where income, outflows, assets, not just GDP, is measured in a similar way all across the world. And what it actually means is that macroeconomists have a common language, so they can actually have things like consumption, GDP, productivity, investment, all those things have a definition which is global. And they even have kind of a grammar, so we actually know that GDP is equal to consumption, investment, government, imports, exports. So actually it's a grammar book and a dictionary. And if you're a macroeconomist from Papua New Guinea meeting somebody from Italy, you can actually speak to the other macroeconomist in your own language. And not only that, they have actually, this language has spread throughout society. So this is an analysis using Google Ngrams, where Google has scanned 200 years of books and looked at all the terminology in the books. And you can see that economic growth actually as a term was hardly used in books in pre-1950. So actually this is just a term that has been introduced into society, and now we all know what economic growth is, or at least we have an association of what it is. And I've put a couple of other terms there as well. The first that might be a bit surprising is Xerox. That's an example of a real multinational, and it's also an example of a multinational where the name of the multinational actually became a verb. To Xerox means to photocopy, it's synonymous. And this actually shows you that a real world multinational can actually have influence on the language of society. And I think that's actually what the SNA and economic growth has actually done. And you know, it's good to think also that climate change and sustainable development are actually also the result of multinationals. Climate change was more or less put on the stage by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and sustainable development was not actually a term that existed pre-1987. There was one report in 1980, but it was actually a constructed word that the UN started to progress. So I think we should be looking at this from a narrative perspective and also from a multinational perspective. Now, the second, as I said, the second question I will be going through quite quickly. What does GDP measure and what not? Well, it measures economic activity, but that is actually what people don't often realize is that it's actually quite hard. To understand growth or to measure growth, you actually have to make a distinction between prices, quantities, and quality. And especially if you think of an iPhone, for example, it's pretty hard to identify what the difference in quality is between an iPhone 7, 8, or wherever we are at the moment, I don't know. But if you had to, in a percentage terms, indicate how much better that iPhone was than a previous version, I guess you will appreciate that that's actually not too easy. Now, digitization has also been a problem in the sense that in the past we would, for example, buy encyclopedias. That would actually contribute to GDP, but nowadays nobody buys an encyclopedia anymore, and we all go to Wikipedia for our information. And so actually that's a free service. That actually led to a reduction in GDP, this conversion. So a lot of free goods are traveling around. And the third aspect, which is difficult, is this globalization aspect. In the past, there would be income, there would be costs, and there would be profits. So the economic activity was mostly in one country. But nowadays, multinationals have a way of siphoning off the profits. So actually, the GDP is no longer, you know, it has problems in terms of its being a measure of economic activity. Now, That's usually that's the criticism that a lot of economists would have on GDP. Now, the main criticism, of course, is that it's not a measure of well-being, sustainability, or equity. First one, for example, is the well-being aspect. It's a well-known paradox called the Easterlin paradox that as GDP increases, in the beginning, happiness scores do tend to trend upwards, but actually at some stage there is kind of a limit to the amounts in the happiness scores, even though GDP increases. Now, I think for this audience, the second one is even more obvious. All this economic growth has come with a huge sustainability challenge together with it. So GDP is definitely not a measure of sustainability. And the third one is, of course, has been very much popularized by Piketty, which shows that actually after the 1980s, or up to the 1980s, inequality was in fact dropping to a large extent. But after the 1980s, this is a graph for the United States, it has actually come back to inequality levels of a year before, or a century before. So to summarize the what is it measuring and what not, well, it is a measure of economic activity, although it does have some challenges there. And the perception that it is a measure of success is clearly not true, especially if you consider, you know, the pursuit of well-being, sustainability, and equity as being real success. Then there are some real problems with using GDP as a measure of success. So, but then we have to turn to the third problem. If it's so obvious that this metric is, you know, not a good measure of success, why does it persist throughout our society? And Samuelson and Nordhaus, two Nobel Prize winners, actually describe GDP as one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. And I think that is true, and it's good to look at it from that perspective. And I think the graph that I showed actually is kind of an innovation cycle where it shows you how an innovation diffuses throughout society. And what we know, of course, from innovation theory is that at some stage, if we have a music as an example, you know, the cassette recorder was replaced by the CD-ROM, and now that was replaced by digital music. And this is a process that we call creative destruction, whereby the previous innovation is actually replaced by the other. And the real question, therefore, is, I think, why, after 50 years of trying, have we not been able to creatively destruct the GDP figure, which clearly, from a scientific perspective, is deficient? Why have we not been able to replace it? And it's not actually through a lack of trying. I think this is one of the, you know, a very famous example from the academic literature called the genuine progress indicator, where we start with a GDP figure, or at least a macroeconomic figure, and we actually see, you know, what things are adding to welfare that's not in the GDP. For example, if leisure time increases, that's something that's contributing to our welfare. But if there are environmental damages or inequality rises, then those are actually reducing welfare. And what the genuine progress indicator does, it gives a monetary value to each of these developments, and then the summary indicator they call the genuine progress indicator. And what is really interesting is that Costanza has measured this for a 50-year period. It was published in Nature. And as you see, while the GDP is kind of showing quite a positive development of ever increasing GDP, if you correct for all the positive and the negative aspects of that GDP growth, and it's more than just the three that I've shown here, there's actually 20 or 30 categories, then you actually see that we haven't been making any progress at all since the 1970s. So this is an insight that has been around for quite a while, but actually, to be quite frank, fairly few people realize that this is there. So this is an example of an index, but there are also, I think, famous examples such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which basically don't have a summary index, but they basically say, well, there's about 170 different things that we should be measuring and that we should be tracking to really identify whether we are going towards a sustainable future. So this is very much an indicator set. So as you can see, there are examples, and there is actually hundreds of examples. In my books, I have an annex where I've tried to summarize at least all the indexes and indicator sets I know. What you see here is actually a subset of my annexes, which already shows that there are at least 40 or 50 different type of indicators, sets or indexes. And the criticism I have is that we're thinking, we are actually, as a community, I think we're a bit of a cottage industry. So in every university, in every institute, there's somebody who's thought of an index, which is really clever according to themselves. But actually, from a broader perspective, we are sending a very confusing message to society, while GDP has this, this very clear message that it's sending all the time. Just have a look at the terminology in this slide. You'll see that there's so many different terms: well-being, sustainability, living planets. There are all types of terms that are used in our community. So my core thesis is that the core reason why we are not successful is that we are not we are competing against a GDP multinational with a lot of power, a lot of logistical organization, while on our side we actually have a cottage industry of very energetic, enthusiastic, and driven people, but we're not really thinking of it in terms of what is our core message to the rest of society. And what I find important from the historical perspective is that actually GDP was also a cottage industry in the 1930s. Many people don't realize this, but actually back then, all different countries measured national income in a different way. And there were very fierce debates about terminology and issues then. It was only after the war that the United Nations basically published the system of national accounts, and that we started to harmonize. And I think that really helped towards creating this multinational. So from my perspective, we should be looking at ourselves actually and seeing whether we're doing enough to create this harmonized message. And I think that's quite conceivable if we actually use the playbook of the macroeconomic community. So we've done the 3 topics of the problem, and now I want to discuss the solution, which again actually is inspired by the macroeconomic community, which to an extent we want to criticize, but I think we also want to admire what they have created. So what did the macroeconomic community actually create? Well, they created a science which has as one of its primary goals to understand and to create policies to create economic growth. So, and I think we should be looking at it from that perspective, that we need a science that is specifically geared towards understanding and creating policies towards well-being, sustainability, and equity. I think in many cases, this is not as if this is a new community, but there are, of course, many communities already contributing to these questions. And I think in terms of the community structure, it's also very clear that this GDP multinational has a very clear structure. So it has this science aspect, it has an accounting framework, and it has a key indicator. And I think, again, we need to replicate that in terms of the structure of the community. And as I said, I do believe that a core aspect of the success of this multinational, the GDP multinational, is this accounting framework, where all the terminology was agreed upon in a global setting. So it makes communication between the community more better, because we actually understand what well-being and sustainability actually means. But it also means that we can communicate better to society. And the last part is the institutionalization. I think it's clear that the macroeconomic community has been institutionalized to a very large extent. And I think we should also do that by 2030. A lot of people, of course, also say, well, we don't have time for this, and I think that's correct. I think from a technical point of view, it could be done a lot faster. But I'm actually talking about changing the narrative, which does, of course, take a lot of time in societies. So in the second part, I just want to dwell on two questions. First, how could we create one of these common languages? And what would actually replace GDP? Now, of course, it would be very inconsistent with my own theory that I present my own indicator, because then I would just be actually contributing to the confusion. So I don't actually at the end have one indicator of which I say, well, this is the answer or this is the science, but I do want to give you a little bit of the architecture that might be behind it and what we might find if we actually collaborated in such a way. So the first question is, how could you create a common language? Well, I think in sustainability thinking, it's actually fairly commonplace to think of systems. And there's, of course, the environmental system, actually, which is the core system. I think sometimes economists some economists, I would say, argue, not all economists, of course, but a lot of economists tend to think of the economy of the core system and then work your way out in terms of theoretical aspects. But I think from a systems perspective, I think, of course, we're part of an environment, part of this, one of the species on this planet. And the second layer to the system is, of course, society. And economy is only the third layer of that, where the economy is part of a broader society. And of course, the distribution is the fourth dimension. So I think nothing very radical. I think this has been discussed for over 30 years, I think, in environmental economics or sustainability. But what I think is important is that we actually try and see whether there are interdisciplinary pieces to this language. Can we actually think of things that are in environmental sciences, in social sciences, and in economic sciences that we actually have in common? And in my book, I do dwell on three aspects. So the first is stock flow accounting. So if you look at the bottom left, you'll see financial assets in a year T. Then there will be income and there will be outflows of money. And then you'll get a new level of financial assets in T+1. And this is very often what people think of when they think of accounting. But actually, if you think of a demographer, they are not doing very much different. They are looking at a population a certain year, then there's birth, there's deaths, and there's migration, and there's population in the year afterwards. If you broaden your mind about accounting, actually a demographer, I would say, is also an accountant. If you look at it from an environmental perspective, the CO2 in the atmosphere is the result of emissions, but it's also the result of uptake in vegetation or the ocean, which leave you with a new CO2 stock in the atmosphere. So again, you might actually say a climate scientist is actually also in some way a stock flow accountant. A second layer of commonality, I think, is networks. Economists have been doing a lot of research into global value chains and global networks, but I think the coronavirus has made abundantly clear that social networks are, of course, also hugely important, not just for the spread of disease, but for other things as well. And the final thing is, of course, that also ecosystem, in a sense, are networks. So actually, that again is a common theme, a common language, which actually spreads across different disciplines, I would say. And the third thing, commonality, that I would suggest is actually limits. So in the top right-hand corner, there's this Rockstrom planetary boundary graphic. And I think in environments, we've done a lot of thinking in terms of limits. But I think actually in societal sciences and economic sciences, there are also instances where there are, of course, limits. There are time limits, for example, in a human's life. And in an economic sense, I've put up a picture of the Tesla Gigafactory, which, was running at full speed, but which couldn't meet the demand of Tesla cars that there were actually there. So even in economics, there are clearly real-world limits to production or to things that you could consume. So I think actually these three things are just examples actually of common features, common language elements that we should be exploring. And so now to the final question that usually also people want to know is, well, we have this GDP, what exactly are you proposing in terms of an alternative? And one of the narratives that is out there at the moment is that we should be focusing on a set of indicators. So in the cartoon you see here, you'll see GDP, this powerful thing that we are admiring. And on the hammer, which the lady is holding, you'll see indicators. So if we put that in terms of the system that we've described, I think a lot of people would say, for example, well, the environmental, economic, societal, and distributional indicators from the system accounts. An example would be the Sustainable Development Goal, which is a long list of indicators, which are indicating whether we are progressing. Now, a lot of economists and environmental economists, they actually like a second option better, and that's the genuine progress indicator that I showed you previously. So don't mind that you can't read the figure on the right. That's the genuine progress indicator, which I just showed you was flattening off in the 1970s. And basically what environmental economists say is, well, we have a theory, a quality approach called welfare economics. We have welfare economics, and from that we can derive monetary values for leisure, for the environment, for social issues, for inequality, and that actually gives you one index. And this actually is kind of the stalemate that Beyond GDP is in at the moment. And I've never really felt very comfortable. I think sustainable development goals are interesting, but they lack this accounting rigor. They lack kind of a notion of which SDG is more important than the other. They lack kind of a relationship. If you improve gender issues, do you improve the economy? What happens to education? There are all types of interactions, which I think from accounting perspective are very important. At the same time, I felt rather uncomfortable with monetization approaches because, putting a monetary value on the environment or on social issues does definitely have a lot of drawbacks, and I would say criticisms that are quite valid. So to actually try and understand what I have developed in the book, I want to take you back to a series from the 1960s called Star Trek. And in Star Trek, there was actually a doctor, and he had a machine called a tricorder. And what you would actually do is, if somebody was feeling ill, you could just point the tricorder towards a person, and they would analyze whether that person was ill or not, and analyze what disease they had within seconds. So they had one machine which could identify whether you were sick or not, and in the COVID crisis, this would be a really useful machine, of course, to have at the moment. But in reality, this is not the reality. Even after centuries of medicine science, what do we have? We don't have a tricorder. We have a doctor who has various instruments to describe, to see what symptoms you have, or how to diagnose your disease. Now, none of these instruments are actually perfect, but together they provide a fairly good diagnosis of what the problem is. And I think that's the way that we should be looking at, replacing GDP as well. We should be asking ourselves, which instruments do we have to assess well-being, sustainability, and equity? All these different systems are interacting, but we want to know, are they progressing towards some kind of positive outcome? And I think we have to be honest with ourselves that there is no tricorder. So I think some economists would say, well, we have this welfare economics. It's been around for over 100 years, and we've created the genuine progress indicator. And while I think it is useful to look at those kind of indicators, I think it's not a tricorder in the sense that it can describe all the diseases that the world basically has. And I think we should be looking in a far more interdisciplinary way at all the different types of quality approaches that exist. I won't go through each of them, but in my book, in my chapter 10, I've tried to be as inclusive as possible to try and think of ways in which we could actually assess the systems that we are in. And I want to show you the value of that by looking at one of the quality approaches that I've identified, called hedonic psychology, up on the top left corner. It was actually created by a Nobel Prize winner in economics called Kahneman, as well as Alan Kruger. And what they actually did was the following. They actually said, well, well-being is actually the results, or if you want to understand well-being, the best thing to do is actually to look at the 24 hours in a day. So in the first column, you'll see the activities that people do. And in the last column, you'll see how much time people spend on that activity. And in the second column, you'll see that the activities are ranked according to the positive or negative effect that people have. So it's an emotion that people have. Now, if you look at the bottom of the list, you'll see actually that the worst thing you can do is to commute to work. That really is probably the worst in terms of feelings, of positive feelings. Working actually also scores quite low, but I want to return to that point. Sometimes people also notice that taking care of my children doesn't actually score that high, which I guess maybe in the current crisis also some people can identify with even more. And of course, top of the list, well, sex, number one, socializing, relaxing, prayer, worship, eating, a lot of things which have to do actually with your social networks rather than goods and services and those kind of things. One thing I do want to point out, I find work quite fascinating also in this aspect. First and foremost, we spend a lot of time working. So if you were to devise a well-being policy in a country, one of the best ways would be to increase well-being would be actually to increase the positive effect that people actually experience during these hours. But what I also find interesting that it scores, while work scores really poorly in terms of the positive aspects, if you look at the column identifying competence, so those are feelings of, am I doing something that is worthwhile or that I think is important or that I'm good at? Then suddenly work scores actually second highest in the entire list of activities. So I think actually what's also interesting about these studies is that it also shows you that well-being, let's be honest, is a fairly complex matter. And also this is not a tricorder. It's just a different perspective to the lives that we are leading. And I've also tried just for this slide or for this exercise as a final exercise, just to look at what would this mean, what would happen to this time use relationship in our current corona crisis. Well, of course, there are two things that are definitely kind of have abruptly stopped, and that is commuting and socializing to a very large extent. Now, I think commuting, there'll be fairly few people that think that that's really awful that we're no longer in these traffic jams. Some people might miss their bike rides to work, but I think also the result of this commuting and not going to conferences, for example, is a lot less CO2 and air pollution, which we've seen. Socializing, of course, is something actually on top of the list in terms of positive effect, which we are experiencing how, what it is to be less social, and how we might actually replace those kind of activities. Now, for the other things, these are just my hypotheses. Exercising down, watching TV is up, I would guess. Shopping, just the essentials, in some countries actually close to zero. Taking care of your children, definitely a lot more. Working, some people have been laid off. Some people are working less, I would say, from home. And some people, for example, in the healthcare sector, of course, are working much, much harder than they used to. But I think, just in terms of what might happen in the COVID crisis, I think actually it's also really useful to think of time use and how that actually is affecting our lives. And I think actually the crucial question will be, we are having a global experience of what life is like in a totally different setting. What long-lasting impacts will that have on our behavior and on our appreciation of what we actually value? Will we still be going to conferences, or have we now decided that actually these kind of seminars are actually also pretty valuable and don't weigh up against the cost that we had in the past? So this is my final slide. In my book, I do definitely ask the UN basically to do what they did after the Second World War with the system of national accounts, and that is to create this panel on well-being, sustainability, and equity. It definitely has to be an interdisciplinary approach and not led by economists. Economists are very important, but there are definitely a lot more other disciplines which I think are actually not prominent enough in the discussion. I think, to be quite frank, the SDGs are so powerful and also quite useful as a frame, so that this might actually or should be linked in some way to the SDG process. I think the end goal that we actually have is not just the technicalities of creating an index or an accounting system. The end goal is that we actually start to influence the narrative of society. So actually we shouldn't be discussing these things with each other, but terms like well-being, sustainability, equity, those should be things that people in society are using, are turning up in newspapers, are turning up in books. And I think perhaps this COVID crisis does create an opportunity, or at least it's interesting to think of how a beyond GDP world would actually look using these various frameworks. Joel and everybody, thanks for your attention. I'll stop sharing the slides at the moment, and I'll hand over back to Joel for the questions.
Okay, thank you a lot, Rutger, for this presentation. So just a quick check. So we have about 60 participants on the event. So thanks everyone for attending. So you can put your question in the Q&A. So you have to write them down to all panelists, and then I will be able to process them. We already have a few, and let me maybe Rutger start with the first one on my side as an economist, environmental economist, sure, but still. So of course, I mean, the discussion on what can replace GDP is linked to the multinational of economic growth being the progress forward. The idea of monetizing the fact that if we enlarge the pie, that will help us to alleviate some of the trade-offs that you've been discussing also on the environment, on health and education. So I'm just wondering what's your opinion on how do you link this with all the discussion on should we pursue economic growth per se?
Yeah, I think you're referring to this discussion about degrowth. For example, some people say, well, we definitely need to, reduce the economy as it is at the moment. And then, of course, there's the green growth perspective, where basically it's kind of the idea, well, actually by getting more economic growth, then we will somehow be able to reduce all the negative aspects and basically pay for those things. And there is, of course, the third perspective that Kate Rayworth and also Jeroen van den Berg, our PhD supervisor, propose. And Kate Rayworth, she calls it being agnostic to growth. I think there's a lot of that in there. So to actually say, well, we shouldn't simply be looking at economic growth as a goal of society. I think that's very important. We should be looking at well-being, sustainability, and equity. Those are the goals of society. And the economic system, in some cases, can help to create that, but it can also hinder that aspect. Now, does that mean, so I'm very much in favor of kind of that perspective, the kind of agnostic perspective. Does that mean that I am against, for example, or do I think green growth and degrowth are equally likely? Because if we do create a growth policy, then it will have a consequence on GDP. And I think it's fairly clear from the Western perspective that our GDP figures are fairly likely to go down, I would say, if we did have an agnostic. I think in third world countries, we also have to be clear that GDP increases in a lot of the world does actually lead to a lot of well-being increases. Half the world population still lives under €5 a day, and it's fairly easy for us to say, well, green growth is rubbish, or we shouldn't be pursuing income growth when half of the world population has to go by on €5 a day or less. So I think it's a complex question, and to be quite frank, I think we should simply stop focusing on GDP and start focusing on the things that are really important, which are well-being, sustainability, and equity. But we need numbers to help us to make the argument. Now they are very vague terms, well-being and sustainability. And the economy used to be a vague term as well. But once the SNA came in and says, this is the economy, then suddenly it became something which we believe is really concrete and specific, while that is not actually the truth of the matter.
But so, I mean, related to that, one of the first questions was really, so a lot of your presentation has been about constructing, I mean, going beyond GDP, but do we really want to build a rival of GDP, or simply an indicator that would be complementary? I mean, both have still their use. So, I mean, is your approach proposing to completely replace, or just to build something which would be complementary?
I would say there's two things that we need to do. First, we need to replace GDP as the goal of society. So we need to have these other three goals. Mm-hmm. And we need to relegate the standing of GDP. So GDP should stop being the goal of society, but it should be a system indicator. It is one of the things, one of the policy instruments that you have to achieve the other three goals. So I would never, in my book, I actually describe also the economic accounts are an integral part of the accounting system because they're really important. And I think GDP could be improved in some ways, but I think you'll always need some kind of measure of income. Although what Stiglitz does say is that if you do that, Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, what he says is we shouldn't be focusing so much on production, but we should actually also be focusing on household income rather than the production of income, because a lot of that income can go to shareholders or not to workers, for example. So actually look at focusing more on household income would probably be a better measure than GDP.
Okay, so I see some more questions coming in. So please keep writing your question in the Q&A part, and I'll try to handle most of them. So there are quite some questions on what do you think about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic? I mean, can it be an activator of the type of change that you're asking for, an activator towards a new measurement of human well-being? I mean, how do you see this?
Well, I think also if you look at it from a historical perspective, some crises we learned from and some crises we didn't learn from. And so from the Great Depression, I think we did learn a lot of things. So macroeconomics created a lot of insight into how to manage the economy after the Great Depression. But I think if we are critical about the last financial crisis in 2008, I do think I sometimes wonder what exactly did we learn from that crisis. It seems to me from a concrete policy perspective, we learned that banks should have bigger buffers so that they don't collapse as fast. But I don't see any systemic changes that have happened from a broader perspective. So I do actually think that a crisis, there is a lot of inertia to actually go back to the system that we had beforehand. And I've heard some discussion by Richard Baldwin on globalization, for example, and he also says, you know, to actually change your behavior or for society to change their behavior, there has to be some kind of payoff. And we have to, our experience of this time has to show us that there is some kind of real benefit actually to leading our lives in different ways. And I don't yet know whether that will be the case, but I do think there are certain things that will be shifting. Our appreciation, for example, of certain jobs as creating value, so healthcare workers, teachers, and also the role of government in you know, in a neoliberal perspective, which we've had for quite a bit. You know, government was generally seen as something that should be as small as possible and was quite often critically reflected upon. I think, you know, it's fairly clear that the government does definitely have quite a valuable role in a lot of these developments, and it's become historically again clear what that role is, and things like you know, healthcare and education, you know, what kind of crucial role research, also scientists, I think, have come out of this crisis also with a renewed kind of stature, and I don't think we will forget that very quickly.
And so again, so related to this, there's quite some questions on who should be really the actors taking this move forward. I mean, is that the responsibility of the states? Is that the UN should the UN be leading this movement? I mean, you mentioned the IP-WISE.
Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah. So if you take back yourself to the 1930s, and actually all the different countries had a different macroeconomic system of measurement, just imagine that each country just had their own path of understanding their own economy, and the UN hadn't come in to actually harmonize that thinking, then I think macroeconomics as a science would not be as good as it is today. You know, collaborating as a global community and trying to understand what drives an economy has, I think, improved the economic thinking, although it hasn't perhaps been as innovative because you know, it's been forced into a framework. And I think the same holds for this intergovernmental panel. I think it is important that we need more convergence in terms of terminology, in terms of measurement. We need to create this logistical framework where statistical offices all over the world are measuring it so that it's kind of compulsory, just as the system of national accounts is. So I do believe that actually international institutes have a huge role to play in this process.
Mm-hmm. And so there's a specific question about the genuine progress indicator that you mentioned early on. So if you could clarify again why you think that this is not a good one to rally around as an alternative to GDP, because it's quite simple and
Yeah.
understandable.
Yes, I think so. To create a general progress indicator, you need to create a monetary value to all the aspects what GDP does measure. Now, for 50 years, very many different methods have been created, and a lot of progress has been made. But even now, there are certain areas where putting a price on something is actually quite difficult or sometimes ethically problematic. So for example, it is possible to put a price on a human life. There are methods to do that. But the question is, do you want, it does lead to the conclusion that life in a third world country is less important or less valuable than life in a country which is expensive. Not all of our lives are worth the same in terms of money with these methods. And going even further, that no methods have been created, especially in the field of social capital. So what is your spouse worth? What are your children worth in terms of money? What are your friends worth? What would you do not to have friends? How much money would you need to replace that? And I think that's where I think monetary valuation really, I think will never be possible. And I think we also need to be honest about valuation of, for example, natural systems. It is possible to create a value for carbon, and Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize last year based on his calculations of a carbon price. But to be quite frank, if you look at the literature, that can vary from $5 to $500. So you can't really say that science has put a price on carbon. They have a method which leads with certain assumptions to a certain value, but it's not a scientific fact that carbon is equal to $89. And I think one of the largest problems that I have with the genuine progress indicator is that, as you saw, it flattened, but I think actually there should be a signal, more of a signal of the huge environmental sustainability problems that we're having. We need an indicator which shows us, the destruction of biodiversity. We need an indicator that shows us also that this climate change is getting out of hand. And I think actually the genuine progress indicator, by just showing that it's flattening off, is actually underestimating the signal that society needs in terms of warning us of problems that are there. So I would never, some people say actually because of the criticism of monetization, you should reject all monetization. I think it is a useful indicator, genuine progress indicator, but I think when economists claim that this is the tricorder and we need nothing else, that's where I become a bit stubborn and say we need other things because your instrument is not perfect.
Yeah. So still about other types of indicator. I mean, you're the indicator specialist. So how about the Human Development Index, for instance, or how about the World Bank approach, which is doing the comparative wealth measurement? I mean, that could be also another initiative compared to the UN leading all this. So what do you think about those?
Yeah, I actually worked for the World Bank project on measuring capital stocks. Yeah, the wealth of nations. Again, I think each of these initiatives adds to the discussion, but none of them are perfect. So I could go through the criticism that I have of the HDI and the praise that I have for the HDI. I could go through the, what I think of capital measurements. But I actually think these are all examples of instruments, none of which are perfect, but each of them are giving us a glimpse into the diagnosis that we are looking for. And that is the point I'd like to make, that I could adamantly argue that none of these ways of measuring are perfect. And so nobody should claim that there is one perfect index. We should actually be thinking of, can we create 3 or 4 or 5 indicators which are all imperfect, but together give us a good enough diagnosis of the problems of our society?
Yeah.
And I think actually one thing I didn't mention is that actually in policy making, New Zealand is leading the way, and I would invite everybody to look up the well-being budget. In New Zealand, they've actually said, well, we are going to really target our society on well-being metrics, and they've actually started to distribute their money based on well-being metrics rather than economic metrics or other metrics. And they've been very successful. And as a parallel, they've also been very successful in the COVID-19 crisis. Now, I don't know whether there's a causality there, but it is an interesting thing that perhaps has nothing to do with each other, but I think is interesting to look at.
Mm-hmm. And I'll take I'll collect two last questions before we close the seminar. We still have 50 people listening to us.
Okay.
That's
yeah.
good. So there's some question about the circular economy. I mean, what could be a best indicator to capture that? I mean, if we give up a capitalist system to go towards a circular economy one. So we would be curious to hear your thoughts about that. And the last question could be about, so I collect both, and if you can answer them one after the other. So you mentioned this interesting the value of time used by Kahneman, an economist again. So is there any attempt to build a more macroeconomic indicator out of that, or what are the current developments on that?
Yes. So the first one was about circular economy. I think if we target the circular economy towards the goals, then actually the circular economy is quite a useful framework to think about how, especially the sustainability aspects, might be improved. In these 3 goals that I've identified. I do want to point out that one of the things which I find a bit frustrating is the prevalence of the word economy. So even in the term circular economy, it does have the word economy. Why is it not? Why are we not striving towards a circular society? And so I think sometimes actually this narrative and this multinational has actually even managed to get certain terminology into even the alternatives that we are trying to create. And actually, I think also if we want to make the economy less important, I think actually if you ask people, circular society is probably a fairly good description of what you're trying to achieve. But circular economy you need because it gives you more credibility and it sounds more professional. So I would point out that, I have become very cognizant of this word economy being around everywhere and even in our own proposals. And the second question is about the Kahneman. It's very expensive to do time use measurement, and it's also it's even more expensive if you want to ask people, how did you feel during a certain activity? So there has been some progress in terms of making that more efficient, but I actually think that big data applications will be making it far more easy to measure time use of people in a bad way and in a good way. So in a bad way, I think we're seeing that even in this crisis, there's a lot of tracking devices, there are apps being developed, and what they actually show is where you are, what speed you're traveling, all those kind of things. Now, that can be used for something good, like identifying who is infecting who. It can, of course, also be used for something that's awful in terms of totalitarian aspects. So I do want to say, of course, that it might be a problem, but I do think actually from a big data perspective, time use measurements will explode in the next 10 years. And actually, this type of measurement will become from something that's really, really expensive to something that's very, very doable. And so up to now, I must say Kahneman's framework has not been very successful, especially because of the cost, I think, not because of the quality of the idea, but because it's just really, really expensive to do time use measurement.
Okay. So thank you a lot, Rutger, again for being with us today. So we will we'll put a link to your book published by Cambridge University Press. So for everyone who is interested in digging further into all those ideas, I invite you to have a look at the book. We'll make sure our library will also have it on its shelves at some point. So thanks a lot, Rutger. Thanks to all the participants for being with us today.
Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, and for the questions, yes.
Yeah.
So the event has been recorded, and it will be, if everything goes well, available on our website in about a week time. So check it out next week again. Our next event will be on May 14th. We'll have another e-seminar within the Center for International Environmental Studies on biodiversity in our food system by Rosalind Raymonds. It is, however, more of an interactive seminar limited to 20 participants. So if you want to join, you'll have to make sure to register their email. So again, thank you everyone. Big thanks to Rutger. It's nice to see that after those 20 years, you're still passionate about your study of environmental economics. So it was a very nice to have you here.
Thanks for the invitation as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you everyone, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.